stuff, so putting it all at the end makes it harder to focus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Concentration is a semester of
Yeah, that's true. I'll have to keep that in mind.
Every 3 weeks, just assign like a few chapters from it. That way, it's like
A little fun thing to
it's
do
like
to
a
compare.
moment,
Yes, because
and then they'll remember anything that happens.
it's so much better to take more time with novels. And the practice, and I haven't taught classes with more than one novel for a little while, but in my classes in graduate school, if we read novels, we read like 10 per class per semester. Fortunately, when I was an undergraduate, I only took one class in which we read novels that was an English class. We read novels in political science because I was a political science minor and a biology minor and a Spanish minor. So how I had time to read novels either is completely beyond me. So let's see. Anyway, has anybody read The Birthmark before?
I don't think so, but it sounds really familiar.
Yes, it's about this mad scientist and his lovely angelic wife. And the wife has a little birthmark on her face, which is almost like a handprint. And she's very beautiful and he loves her very much, but the birthmark really bugs him. So he tries to find a way to get rid of it. That's kind of the narrative of the story. So I don't know how to make this bigger. Oh, I know there's a green button. It's still not bigger. Sorry, Judy, I cannot make it bigger. Judy is one of the online people who watches all the videos, who's old like me. So anyway, the story has this American romanticist fascination with nature. So it starts off in probably what is a very off-putting way in talking about natural science and nature. All the kindred mysteries of nature seem to open paths into the region of miracle. It was not unusual for the love of science to rival the love of woman in its depth and absorbing energy. The higher the intellect, the imagination, the spirit, and even the heart might all find their congenial element in pursuits which, as some of their ardent votaries believed, would ascend from one step of powerful intelligence to another until the philosopher should lay his hand on the secret of creative force and perhaps make new worlds for himself. So what that great way to start a story, right? How many people are going to keep reading after that sentence? But what Hawthorne is saying is that philosophical ideas, spiritual ideas, and scientific ideas are all getting conflated in this historical moment. When you think about craniology, it's a political idea designed to subjugate black people, but it gets turned into a science. So there we have the conflation of politics and science. The spiritual became something more scientific because there was a movement called spiritualism in which people had seances, and everyone in crazy New England went to it for entertainment. There was a famous group called the Fox Sisters who would sit on a stage at a table, and the spirits would rap messages, not rap as in Run DMC, but, like this. And they would interpret it and tell people, like your average psychic might today, about their future or what their deceased loved ones have to say to them. And nobody had the sense to realize that if you're sitting at a table, and they were always sitting at a table with a tablecloth on it, that it was pretty easy to fake that. So they eventually got, what do you call it? When you reveal someone's fraud. Yeah, they got discovered and discredited. But Hawthorne didn't buy into any of those fads. So the fad of racial science, the fad of spiritualism, these crazy things that people were doing, he was much more conservative about. So what he's trying to say about this particular mad scientist, Elmer, is that he thinks he can find the meaning of life or the source of life. He can use science to find the creative force that gives life. Many people believe that the creative source that gives life comes from God, and it's the soul. So where is the line between life and death? If we're advanced in science and technology, why can't we cure any disease and keep people alive forever? Very wealthy people get their brains frozen, right? And Hawthorne probably would not have signed up for that because he was very skeptical of all of the new technology and science that was developing in this time period. For example, railroads started to come into every city through many towns. There was the race science. There was a whole series of movements having to do with health. So one of the reasons in the novel Wench that they go to this particular place in Ohio is because there are springs, and they're supposed to cure you of tuberculosis, and everyone had tuberculosis. Do you guys all have to get tuberculosis tests, by the way, or just people who live in one dorm?
I haven't been told to get one, but I'm also a commuter, so.
Okay.
I know you have to get a TB test that's up to date every 6 to 12 months or whatever for education, so you can go into schools.
Wow. Did you know that somebody upstate was diagnosed with TB?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And it's a radical thing today, which is part of the onward march of science that was going on during Hawthorne's lifetime, but in a much more minuscule way. So many people had tuberculosis. Emerson's brother, who was his best friend, who he wanted to have a double wedding with so that they could live together with their wives in one house, who was the smarter Emerson. Waldo was the dunce. Charles was the smart one. Died very suddenly at the age of 36 from tuberculosis. So Waldo's son, who was 4, and his namesake died when he was a child. And 20 years later, Emerson couldn't believe his son was gone, so he dug up the casket and opened it to see that it was still the body of a child and that he hadn't grown and matured and that he was trapped in time and really gone. Because he never apparently got over his grief for his child. Now that sounds really gothic right there.
So it's Annabelle Lee.
Yeah. But so many people died from tuberculosis, and you usually had the funeral or the wake, right in the home. They were used to dead bodies. They were used to young people dying. So many women died in childbirth, too, if they didn't die from tuberculosis. So their death was much more imminent and much less scary. But the idea that science could solve some of these problems, and particularly in a time of this tuberculosis crisis in 1830 to 1865, when people were dropping like flies from tuberculosis, the idea that medicine could heal people with TB was like a miracle. So it was like an act of God in the magnitude and the difference it would have made in the lives of so many people being sick. But there were also these health movements. So in Yellow Springs, they had a resort you could go to so you could drink the water and bathe in the water, and that was supposed to cure your tuberculosis. You get fresh air. So the idea of being able to drink fresh water was a radical new concept. Sylvester Graham invented the graham cracker because instead of eating white bread, if you ate graham crackers, you'd get more fiber and you could poop more. So in addition to drinking water, people were really constipated back in the day. And I'm not just saying this because I'm crazy. I have letters between poets and activists in which they talk about their bowel movement or lack thereof. Do you not know how to translate this? Just when she's looking, you want to make sure she doesn't miss that part. So, this whole idea of bodily functions, being able to cure things, Mylanta would have been really revolutionary. But the graham cracker was the first way to cure. I don't really think it's a very good cure, not that I've tried it, but anyway. So Hawthorne's very skeptical about these movements, about spiritualists, about drinking water and going to the springs, which are supposed to be the spring of life, and eating graham crackers, not to mention the anti-slavery movement. He complained about people talking about slavery all the time in Concord because it bored him. The women's rights movement totally put him off. And I don't think he had much to say about the Mexican War either, which is interesting because his friends were all about it. Like, he was friends with Thoreau, who got arrested to protest it, and Emerson had to bail him out of jail. And Hawthorne, meanwhile, is living in Emerson's house and being supported by him, and it's like, yeah, I don't care. It must have been interesting conversations when you have this guy who's not interested in politics whatsoever, and that is Hawthorne. But I think he's kind of resisting and making fun of. I read him really satirically because we know he makes fun of religion in The Minister's Black Veil, and we know that one of his direct ancestors was a judge in the Salem witch trials. Did you know that? I should have added the witchcraft video instead of the transcendentalism video. That would have been more engaging. Maybe I'll look at adding that. So Hawthorne was liked to make fun of ministers and puritanical values and extremist religion, much like Elizabeth Cady Stanton would, bless you, many years later. But this connection between science and spirituality, I think he's continually making fun of his time period. But that's my interpretation. What Hawthorne stories have you read before? Or have you read any of the novels?
Did you do Young Goodman Brown?
We did not do Young Goodman.
Well, did Hawthorne?
He did write it.
Okay,
Yes.
because I've read that and I read Scarlet Letter.
Okay. So that whole critique of Puritanism. And it's interesting that in those critiques of Puritanism, in Young Goodman Brown, the joke at the end is that he's trying to resist the devil and he can't, but then his pure angelic wife ends up at the devil's meeting before he does. And in the Scarlet Letter, there's a lot of feminist readings of the Scarlet Letter. So it's interesting that Hawthorne kind of resisted and refused to talk about women's rights, and then people read the Scarlet Letter kind of in a feminist way, but he's critiquing the culture that ostracized Hester Prynne. Did you all have to read the Scarlet Letter? Yeah. I don't really like the Scarlet Letter because it's way too long.
My best memory of the Scarlet Letter is when our teacher spent an entire day talking about witchcraft
Yeah.
and the Salem witch trials.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite test to see if someone's a witch is they drown her in the lake. If she floats, she's a witch.
Mm-hmm.
If she doesn't,
She was
she's down at the
innocent.
bottom of the lake.
Yeah. Yeah. And they very often had to be naked for some of these
They just found
tests.
an excuse to kill people.
Yeah. And Hawthorne was aware of that. I actually do like one Hawthorne novel very much, and it's The House of the Seven Gables, and it deals with real estate. You know, it's about building a house on a place that somebody lost due to the witch trials. So this family's legacy is a home that they stole from somebody that they said was a witch, and he was actually hung on the property. But even before that, you know, there is kind of thoughts about the indigenous people who were there. So Hawthorne thinks about those things. And the family is degenerate not because of race, but because of the sins of their fathers, essentially. But it's also really funny. There's this whole section about a chicken that is just classic. I really like The House of the Seven Gables. But I guess I don't really find any of this mid-19th century literature interesting unless I think it's funny. And not very many other people think it's funny. So when we look at Harriet Jacobs, for example, what happened to her is not funny. That she was sexually harassed by her master when she was enslaved and had to escape from slavery and endure hardships is not funny. But so much of what she says and the sarcasm with which she says it, I think is hilarious. Because she's writing for a white northern audience in which she can have this voice that is earnest and pure. But there's also a way of reading things that I think her black contemporaries read them that is making fun of things, kind of like I enjoy reading Phyllis Wheatley, you know, as having two distinct voices going on at the same time. So it has to be funny and entertaining to me. Now, this story is fairly entertaining. The young husband says, "Has it ever occurred to you that the mark on your cheek might be moved?" And actually, he goes so far to say, "You're so perfect. You have this defect, which we hesitate whether to term a defect or a beauty. It shocks me as being the visible mark of earthly imperfection." And she's devastated by this, that it shocks him. And she decides that in order for him to love her, she has to let him do whatever he wants to her, which is really the epitome of female submission. Now, Hawthorne didn't enjoy the women's rights movement, but he also, in this story, is illustrating the dangers of complete female submission. So, there's contradictions everywhere, and kind of makes me want to interview him and ask him. I shouldn't say that because then I'll have a dream that I'm talking to him, which is how I wrote my dissertation, which was not about Hawthorne. I had dreams about talking to the authors I was writing about. And I'm recording this, so you will have evidence that I'm insane. So there is a singular mark deeply interwoven that looks like a tiny hand, a tint of deeper crimson, which had a little rosiness around it. But when she blushed, it became more indistinct and finally vanished amongst the blush of redness in her cheeks. So it's interesting that when she blushes, it goes away. And when she blushes, he's not reminded then of her imperfection, because what can make you blush? Embarrassment. Crudeness. Exercise. And very often sex. So there's a little bit about it going away when she's blushing, that he's okay with her during sex. But the rest of the time, when they're not having sex, he sees that she's not perfect and it bothers him. So I only point that out because it's weird. I don't know what it means. So it looks like a little beautiful human hand. Had she been less beautiful, if envy's self could have found aught else to sneer at, he might have felt his affection heightened by the prettiness of this mimic hand. But since she was otherwise perfect, this one defect grows more and more intolerable with every moment of their united lives. The fatal flaw of humanity which nature, in one shape or another, stamps ineffaceably on all of her productions, either to imply that they are temporary and finite, or that their perfection must be wrought by toil and pain. Now that wrought by toil and pain is kind of what the Bible says about having children, right? So that a woman, has children wrought by toil and pain, which again leads back to when she blushes, it goes away. But she's imperfect, and it bothers him terribly and becomes more and more of a problem because it reminds him of mortality and it reminds him of female sexuality. Because you have to have sex in order to have a baby. No, I didn't, but I won't go into that. Fertility clinics. Hawthorne would be so upset. Anyway, I can't believe I'm recording this. The virgin birth. Anyway, he convinces her that by continually kind of nagging her that he should let her experiment on him. And she brings up the subject for the first time and says, "Do you remember that you were having a dream last night about this odious hand?" And he says, "No, honey, don't worry. I am not put off by it at all. I'm not really disgusted by it. Shock, I didn't mean shock." And he's trying to hide his emotions. "I might dream of it, but if before I fell asleep I was thinking about it." And so she's like, oh, so that is what you were dreaming about. She kind of tricked him into admitting, as wives apparently will do. Then there's a little thinking about the ways that dreams affect us. And in the dream, he is with his servant Aminadab, which is backward spelling of bad anima. So their animism, or the idea of a spirit that connects us all, being kind of the spirit of life, is the play on words that Hawthorne's using there. So the spirit, so he might be critiquing the idea of animism, that we're animated by a spirit. You know, maybe he was really an atheist. I don't know. But this guy is bad anima, and he is the very earthly counterpoint to the very, and dark and small, to the tall and ethereal Elmer. Anyway, he has the dream that he is with Aminadab, attempting an operation for the removal of the birthmark, but the deeper went the knife, the deeper sank the hand, until at length its tiny grasp appeared to caught hold of Georgiana's heart, whence, however, her husband was inexorably resolved to cut or wrench it away. So he has a really vivid dream that he's cutting her face and ends up going all the way to her heart, because that's how badly he wants to get rid of this sign of imperfection. So we can only assume that even in the dream that didn't work out well. But he was, she knows that he is, she figures out by hearing him say, it is in her heart now, we must have it out. You know, she knows that the dream was really intense and really graphic. So she's like, okay, whatever we need to do, we need to, I don't know what the cost might be to get rid of this birthmark, but I might end up deformed, but it may go as deep as life itself. But I'll do anything to make you happy so you can remove it. And he says, oh, I've thought of many ways to do that. Great, I'm glad you brought it up. Because he's a crazy man. And then he begins, he says, you know, I have to reassure you that I do actually know how to remove this, and that these potions that I'm going to give you aren't actually going to hurt you, and that these crazy experiments I'm going to do, and when I take you into my laboratory, it will all be just fine. Don't worry about it. So I think one of the first things that he does is he brings her a flower that he destroys and then brings back to life. Or perhaps she touches the flower and it wilts. I need to find that section. He brings her into the library. She is terrified. And he yells for Aminadab, his assistant. And we find out that Aminadab has to do all the physical aspects like a typical lab tech. With his vast strength, his shaggy hair, his smoky aspect, and the indescribable earthiness that encrusted him, he seemed to represent man's physical nature, while Almer's slender figure and pale intellectual face were no less apt a type of the spiritual element. So, his vast strength, his smoky, I guess he might not be small. I don't know where I got that idea. But he's dark and swarthy in appearance, and very earthy and very strong. So he says, he finds out what's going on. He sees Georgiana, and he was like, if I had a wife like that, I would not carry on with this crap. So even though he's not the spiritual, aesthetic one, even though he's the earthy one, he says he would never do something like that. Which is Hawthorne critiquing something? You know, the spiritual aspect, perhaps, of Elmer, the intellectual face, the spiritual element. What do you think he's critiquing in Elmer when this very lowly character comes along and says, "Oh, I'd never do that," because you know this isn't going to go well. He could just be critiquing intellectuals in science And thank God that never happens anymore. Oh, wait. So they continue with the process. Georgiana wakes up and is becoming more and more self-conscious about her birthmark, which is now a terrible mark. He says, "Fear not, do not shrink from me, believe me. I even rejoice in this single imperfection, since it will be such a rapture to remove it. Oh, spare me. Pray do not look at it again. I never can forget that convulsive shudder." So she's terribly traumatized by his aversion to her imperfection. So he brings her this plant, and it magically grows out of the earth, this pot of earth, and turns into a slender and lovely flower. So he's invented Miracle-Gro, but a really good kind of it apparently, and the plant just grows in a matter of seconds. And she says, "Oh, it's magical, I should not touch it." And he says, "Go ahead, pick it, smell it, it smells really good. The flower will wither in a few moments and leave nothing save its brown seed vessels, but then may be perpetuated, a race as ephemeral as itself." That's a really weird thing about reproduction. There's this beautiful flower, but it really quickly withers and becomes ugly and dies, but its seeds continue to perpetuate the race. Like, is that a view of a woman's life? Is that Catherine Beecher's description of a woman's life? You get to be this beautiful flower, and your whole purpose is to make the seeds, and you're not going to last long, and you're going to wither and die, but the race continues. Just something to think about. So she touches the flower, and the whole plant turns coal black as though it's been perfect, and dies a little more quickly than even Elmer expected. And he said, "Oh, maybe you're just a little too stimulating to it." So again, he's just kind of passive-aggressively saying that ugly birthmark is really dangerous. So he does a few more experiments and doesn't do a great job with his experiments. Mixes together some chemicals, and she says to him, he tells her he has the elixir vitae, is it called? He tells her he has a magical, the quaffer of the immortal nostrum. He gave the history of all the alchemists who tried to make some kind of elixir that could bring people back to life. The elixir vitif, I guess, is a Latin term. Anybody know? And when he tells her that he's working on this thing and he's going to try it on her, she's like, "Oh no, don't do that." Because it's like, zombie medicine, right? Like bringing people back to life who have died. Like, we kind of want to do it, but how quickly do you have to do it? And would people, if you believe in heaven, and if you're a Christian, why the heck would you want to come back here? If you can stand up at those pearly gates and see your grandma again, what would you want to come back here? Anyway, she doesn't like this idea of moving forward with technology and science so that you can control life and that you can bring people back to life. So they knew about zombies because during the Haitian Revolution, and she actually went to Cuba and lived on a plantation and collected folklore. Hawthorne's wife, not Georgiana. They knew about Haitian lore and about the power of Odon and about zombies. So it's not that they were completely oblivious to the fact that during the Haitian Revolution, they would give a certain herb to slaves who then would appear to be dead, and they would bury them. But then they would come back and they would give them the antidote. And if the antidote worked, they would come back to life from a catatonic state and run away. And the owners didn't know that all the slaves there was many slaves running away this way. So that's technically what a zombie is. The cure, I think, is called the zombie cucumber. So there's a connection there to, resistance and revolution, to having the power to change the world so much that you can control life and death. And the fact that it happened in the Haitian Revolution is a big world-changing kind of historical event, too. So she says, no, come on. Hold on, honey. Are you in earnest? It is terrible to possess such power, even to dream of possessing it. And then he says, oh, don't worry about it. It might remove the birthmark. And he strips away all of her moral authority and all of her beliefs and all of her resistance because he's so obsessed with this birthmark, and she'll do anything to please him. So it's the gold-colored liquid that is the beautiful elixir of life. And he says it can make you immortal. I could apportion the lifetime of any mortal whom you might point your finger. The strength of the dose would determine whether he were to linger out years or drop dead in the midst of a breath. No king on his guarded throne could keep his life if I in my private station should deem that the welfare of millions justified me in depriving him of it. And that's a really controversial question. Also about revolution. Should you depose the monarchy in order to protect the lives of millions? So in this time period, there was also a lot of revolutionary activity that Hawthorne's close friend, Margaret Fuller, who was also a writer, moved to Italy because of the revolutions going on in Italy and Hungary. I think they were deposing the Turks or something. But there was a lot of revolutionary fervor in Europe. Margaret Fuller, Hawthorne's close friend and neighbor, went to join this revolution. So this question of whether it's justifiable to use Aylmer's elixir to depose a king that's suppressing his subjects is curiously close to, is it okay to fight a revolution and change the world so rapidly and radically? This question of revolutionary change. So this is why I think that Hawthorne is whoa, hold on a little bit, wait a minute, with all of the changes that are happening in his world, or maybe asking people to think about them in a moral and ethical way. So he says, are you going to bathe my cheek with this lotion? And he says, oh no, this elixir is not strong enough for you. I need to use something much more stronger. So he's made her birthmark like a bigger deal than if she died. So she starts to feel like she was already subjected to certain physical influences that she took in with the fragrance of smelling the elixir. She thought it was her fancy, but something is happening in her bodily system. She has a sensation creeping through her veins and tingling, half painfully at her heart, half painfully, half pleasurably. Still, whenever she dared to look in the mirror, she beheld herself as a white rose with the crimson birthmark stamped upon her cheek. Not even Aylmer now hated it as much as she. So we have a lot of talking about his powers and all of this stuff. That's part of the issue with Hawthorne's stories. It's a suspenseful story, but some of his segues are worse than my tangents. Get to the point, dude. You're worse than me. Talk about long sentences. So eventually we get to the end of the story, and I don't want to be the spoiler alert person here. You'll have to go ahead and read the end of the story to find out what happens. And there's